the paper I'm presenting today that I prepared is hopefully just sort of getting us into some of the issues around Whitehead's ecological metaphysics. And it's sort of bringing together a lot of the work that I did here as a student at Claremont when I did my master's degree here, where I did a lot of work with Eco-Theology and learning Whitehead for the first time around here. And then I went off to Drew with one of John Cobb's students, Catherine Keller, and continued to do some more work in philosophy, a little less in eco-theology. So I'm sort of trying to bring those two conversations together here in what follows. So the paper's called Whitehead's Alternative: The New Realism, Eco-Theology, and Planetary Politics. While Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy continues to influence many progressive Christians, thinkers in other religious traditions are increasingly drawn to it as well. This is revealed in a recent book entitled Religions in the Making: Whitehead and the Wisdom Traditions of the World. It offers examples of Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Taoist appropriations of Whitehead's philosophy, which often includes religious themes about God, rituals, and mystical experience. But many of the contributors are also attracted to Whitehead's ecological metaphysics, with its vision of a world of becoming filled with interrelated events. As Catherine Keller explains, Whitehead significantly influenced the development of environmental spirituality, or eco-theology, which are examples of emerging ways to reassociate theology with what matters. Eco-theologians hope to awaken our culture from the sense that the matter at hand is some dull, opaque stuff, some lifeless and unfeeling substratum that we with our computer-like brains can manipulate however we please, Keller writes. What is perhaps more surprising than Whitehead's broad eco-religious appeal is his increasingly important influence on thinkers who do not identify with any of the so-called wisdom traditions. Indeed, it has been suggested that we are now in the midst of a Whiteheadian turn in philosophy, which is remarkable considering the fact that Whitehead was virtually ignored in most philosophy departments for decades. So why is it then that non-religious philosophers are suddenly attracted to Whitehead? By my lights, it is largely due to his ecological cosmology. A new generation of philosophers has seemed to realize that Whitehead offers a timely alternative to anthropocentric, mechanistic ways of thinking that have dominated Western philosophy for centuries, and that have also supported ecologically destructive and neoliberal policies. So these non-religious thinkers thus de-emphasize the religious elements of Whitehead's philosophy and highlight the ways in which he redirects our attention to the more than human, to the fragile and unruly nature of which we are a part and upon which we depend for our well-being. As Whitehead wrote famously, "We find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures." So one of my goals for this paper is to further explain why and how Whitehead has been influencing some of the most exciting eco-philosophies over the last decade, including speculative realism and the new materialism. What these movements have in common with Whitehead is four interrelated positions, which I'll unpack in this paper a little bit. First, a commitment to complex forms of realism about the non-human. Second, a redistribution of intrinsic value from the human to our fellow creatures. Third, a rejection of modern mechanistic views of nature. And fourth, a critique of Kantian and post-Kantian anti-realisms. Even though these new realists often ignore process theology, I do also want to show how these perspectives in philosophy resonate with those of process theologians like John Cobb and David Ray Griffin. For decades, these two eco-theologians have been sounding the alarm about the climate crisis and calling for religious and secular persons to seize the alternative vision of Whitehead. So might this growing convergence between secular philosophies and pluralistic theologies offer support to movements that resist the neoliberal ideology of unfettered markets, which drives the devastation of our planet? I will conclude by suggesting this possibility. From the beginning of the modern period, Western philosophy became increasingly preoccupied with questions of access, epistemology, or how we know what we know. As Timothy Morton explains, these questions include, how can I know that there are or are not real things in the world? What gives me or denies me access to the real? And what defines the possibility of access? While such questions are not unimportant, the consequence of privileging epistemology in Western thinking has been that questions of reality, ontology, or what we know beyond the human were often minimized and in some cases eliminated entirely from philosophical work. For Whitehead and an increasing number of philosophers today, this refusal to speculate beyond the human resulted in the dominance of dangerously anthropocentric and mechanistic worldviews in modernity. So by contrast, metaphysical questions about the nature of humans, non-humans, and the gods were central for most Greek philosophers and medieval cosmologists, who often affirmed the genuine reality of the non-human. As Michael Northcott points out, although pre-modern cosmologies were hierarchical and quite anthropocentric, they often still viewed the Earth as a living organism, rather than in the modern image of a mechanistic machine. The pre-modern idea of an organic cosmos was one in which humans were connected to everything within a great chain of being. There was no sharp divide between human culture and non-human nature. As such, unlike present-day climate denialists, most classical and medieval philosophers had little trouble believing that human activity influences nature, and indeed even the weather. But as Bruno Latour argues, to be modern just is to divide human culture and politics from nature. Consequently, modernity empowered humans to dominate nature, namely to reduce it to a collection of valueless data for scientific, political, and economic manipulation. As Northcott sort of summarizes this approach, modernity's bifurcation between human culture and mechanistic nature, quote, underlies the development of a coal-fueled industrial culture, a cosmology in which land is conceived as empty space, unowned and disordered until it is developed and reordered by humanity for the creation of wealth. Against this destructive modern image of nature, Whitehead's philosophy of organism, his cosmology, is in a sense a return to pre-modern organic views, even as he moves beyond them towards a more democratic and non-anthropocentric perspective. In fact, Isabel Stingers has argued that Whitehead's entire project can be understood as one long critique of the so-called bifurcation of nature, which for him is rooted in Kantian philosophy. So Kant's bifurcation between human knowers and non-human nature was motivated, in a noble way, by his effort to preserve a space for human freedom and morality against a nature that was then viewed as a valueless, deterministic machine within the Newtonian paradigm. He was convinced that we cannot actually know the non-human world as it truly is, for we can never get beyond our mental constructions of it. We can only know objects as they appear to us and not as they are in themselves. Since what is real ultimately depends upon the structure of the human mind, for Kant, it is impossible to attribute genuine reality and arguably therefore value to non-humans apart from human cognition of them. As such, Morton notes that, quote, speculating outside of the human became a very minor trend after Kant's philosophy. Nature was sort of pushed off into the background by subsequent anti-realist philosophies that dominated Western thinking, including much postmodernism that developed out of the linguistic and hermeneutical turns. Indeed, the Kantian reduction of philosophy to epistemology and the bifurcation of nature have been crucial in the development of continental philosophy. As Stephen Shaviro writes, who is at this conference, by the way, phenomenology, structuralism, and most subsequent schools of 20th century continental philosophy assume one version or another of the anti-realist Kantian claim that phenomena, or the appearances of nature, depend upon the mind to exist. Many philosophers have also read Martin Heidegger, that great foundation for so much postmodern continental thinking, as also a kind of anti-realist, who argued that we cannot talk of the real existence of things apart from the human. As he wrote in Being and Time, only as long as Dasein is his name for human subject, essentially, in his work, is there being or existence, he wrote. Thus, after Kant and Heidegger, many came to believe that philosophy is about linguistic and cultural analysis, not about making claims about the reality of things or non-human nature. Taken to the absolute extreme in some forms of philosophy, the world can get reduced to an arbitrary social or linguistic construction. However, recent speculative philosophers have attempted to develop methods that adventure beyond the Kantian bifurcations and post-Kantian anti-realisms. Crucially, these so-called new realists see Kant's epistemological dualism as supporting anthropocentric habits of thought that have partially led and supported in some ways to our ecological climate crisis. So drawing on strands of continental and American philosophy, speculative realists like Morton, who I just mentioned, Stephen Shaviro and Graham Harman, and new materialists like Karen Barad, Jane Bennett, and William Connolly present challenges to Kant's bifurcation of nature. This is not without historical precedent. In fact, many of these new realists readily acknowledge their dependence on Whitehead's much earlier critique of the so-called bifurcation of nature, with its, as Whitehead put it in his great book, Process and Reality, degradation of the world into mere appearance. Like Whitehead and continental postmodernists, the new realists reject naive realism and foundationalism. For them, the non-human world remains deeply mysterious in many respects. But they are critical of philosophers who refuse to speculate beyond the human to account for the materiality or the reality of the non-human in some way. They do not advocate objectifying modes of speculation, but rather take a more indirect route through metaphor and aesthetics. Or as Whitehead said, metaphysics is a series of metaphors mutely appealing for imaginative leap. As Stephen Shaviro also explains, 21st century speculation begins where our knowledge ends. Far from making dogmatic claims, this new form of speculation paradoxically explores the space of the ungraspable and the time of the unpredictable. While strategies vary, all are committed to a speculative wager on the possible returns from a renewed attention to reality itself, Shaviro writes. By imagining new forms of robust ontological realism through metaphysical speculation, the hope of the new realists is to regain the great outdoors, according to Shaviro. So with Whitehead, they seek to redistribute value and reality, which are connected for these thinkers, to the non-human, and to thereby overcome the bifurcation or the nature-culture dualisms that has dominated so much Western thinking and that has supported so much environmentally destructive activities. As philosopher Crispin Sartwell notes, a major motivation for the realist turn in modern philosophy has been ecological. Climate change isn't just in our heads or in our descriptions, but a real-world situation that requires real-world physical transformations. The climate crisis thus seems to have sparked an ecological turn in some corners of philosophy, and it has been significantly aided by Whitehead. And for process theologians like Cobb and Griffin, who have worked so long to make the case for Whitehead's ecological realism, this is undoubtedly good news. In 1970, decades before the new realist turn in philosophy, John Cobb began writing one of his most important books, Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology. Few theologians were engaging theology from an ecological perspective at that time. So this was a truly pioneering work. Upon publication in 1972, it was the first single-authored, book-length environmental ethics text to deal with the ecological crisis. It developed out of Cobb's awakening to the environmental crisis in 1969, which he now calls his conversion to the earth, because it forever changed the way that he understood his theological vocation. No longer could theology be done apart from concern to the earth, for the earth. No longer could one write and speak about theology without accounting for the full reality of the non-human. While he was a Whiteheadian from the beginning of his career, Cobb did not take the ecological dimensions of Whitehead's cosmology seriously until the 1970s. But with Is It Too Late, with its ecological reading of Whitehead, Cobb proclaimed that everything must change. We need a new Christianity in solidarity with the earth, he wrote. In light of the new realism, Cobb's Eco-Theology in Is It Too Late now seems prophetic. Throughout the text, Cobb offered critiques of Kant's bifurcation of nature. In Kant's thought, the modern movement toward a completely human-centered view of reality is radicalized, Cobb argued. Like the new realists, Cobb also claimed that most philosophies after Kant were anthropocentric, placing almost all priority and value on the human side. As Cobb explains, the conclusion of my survey of the major schools of modern philosophy is that none of them have attributed significant reality to things in themselves. Thus, for most modern philosophers, love or concern for our fellow creatures would be viewed as mere sentimentality. To this day, Cobb remains convinced that Whitehead is one of the very few Western philosophers to present a viable alternative to anthropocentric views of creation. As he concludes, Whitehead's philosophy pictures for us a world filled with real events, each having its own intrinsic value, especially those that are alive, significantly share with us in feeling and activity. It is therein that the needed attitude of love, concern, and reverence for living things is adequately grounded, he wrote. So in addition to these philosophical issues, Cobb was also critical of his Christian tradition that too often privileged humans at the expense of non-humans. Against any use of Genesis to justify human domination of nature, Cobb writes that when God proclaimed the non-human creation good, this was, quote, without reference to human beings. Its goodness is intrinsic. It shares with humanity the status of creaturehood. Thus, when human beings are freed to govern the world they govern is not thereby reduced to mere means to their end. As such, much of Cobb's work within eco-theology as a Christian has centered on rethinking the human-non-human relationship. His early strategy was to bring together Christian ecological thinkers that received very little attention in some ways, such as St. Francis of Assisi and even Albert Schweitzer, with Whitehead's cosmology, which envisions the universe as a vast ecological system of interrelated and valuable events, he writes. So David Ray Griffin has also argued in favor of Whitehead's ecological perspective, very recently, in fact, particularly in relation to his concept of God. To be sure, David Ray Griffin's eco-theology goes beyond what the largely secular new realists find helpful in Whitehead. But I think it is a valuable perspective for many religious persons. According to Griffin, Whitehead provides a crucial challenge to supernaturalistic forms of theism that often fuel climate denialism and inaction. Supernaturalism, as Griffin defines it very carefully, is the traditional theistic idea that an omnipotent deity who can do virtually anything resides outside the world and intervenes periodically within the natural processes to perform miracles. This is a common view amongst fundamentalist Christians and many right-wing politicians, but it often produces what Griffin calls omnipotence-based complacency. Griffin offers recent illustrations of how supernaturalism can support climate denialism, and often does, as well as complacency. For example, Republican Senator Jim Inhofe has claimed that, quote, God is still up there and he promised to maintain the seasons. Inhofe then went on to criticize the, quote, arrogance of people who think that we, human beings, will be able to change what God is doing to the climate. And Rush Limbaugh similarly argued, if you believe in God, then intellectually you cannot believe in man-made global warming because that would make humans, rather than God, omnipotent. Supernaturalism also tends to ground apocalyptic end times theology, which studies show, Griffin notes, often makes conservative Christians less likely to support policies designed to curb global warming than other Americans. And finally, supernaturalism tends to encourage conservatives to view extreme weather events as acts of God, rather than in connection to climate change, which is largely the consequence of the human burning of fossil fuels. As Griffin writes, vested interests in the status quo seize upon the belief that the world is in God's hands to promote the complacent assumption that continuing to burn fossil fuels will not destroy civilization, because God will not allow it, supposedly. History is, however, filled with examples of people who foolishly believe that they were under the mantle of divine protection. Griffin does not exclude the possibility that other theologies outside of process thought can embrace a robust sense of climate morality, but he does strongly caution against the consequences of a supernaturalistic worldview. As one alternative, Griffin argues that Whitehead's panentheism can embrace climate morality without equivocation. Whitehead rejected an interventionist, omnipotent deity who is beyond nature. His God acts persuasively rather than coercively by offering possibilities for each creature to actualize or to reject. Whether living or non-living, Everything has some amount of agency to respond to the divine lure, in Whitehead's thought. God cannot therefore control outcomes in the world decisively, but requires creaturely responses to bring about divine purposes. Consequently, Griffin concludes, the climate is not in God's hands. Extreme weather is never the direct result of divine action, and humans do indeed bear responsibility for the climate crisis. To avoid the ecological collapse of civilization, Griffin argues, God needs creaturely cooperation. To be sure, the new realists do not affirm any sort of God, including Whiteheads. But like Cobb and Griffin, they are more concerned to critique the dominant God of our time, the market. In many cases, the actual referent of supernatural rhetoric from conservative religious, political, and corporate leaders is less a theistic God and more often the invisible hand of the market. Echoing Cobb and Griffin's political theologies, political theorist William Connolly argues that the market is the supposedly omnipotent object of worship for so many neoliberals who support the deregulation of markets at the expense of the environment, infinite expansion and growth on a finite planet, the externalization of costs into the environment to maximize profits, corporate power and privileges at the expense of workers and the environment, selective state activism to maintain the neoliberal ideology of unregulated markets, and an inflated view of self-organizing market rationality. So drawing on Whitehead's cosmology, Connolly then goes on to argue that impersonal markets are just simply one kind of self-organizing process, which alters and is altered by other human and non-human processes of various kinds. So markets are fragile, not omnipotent. But neoliberalism, which presumes the bifurcation of nature, situates politics and economics in the higher realm of human culture above non-human nature. As Connolly explains, it thereby downplays the self-organizing powers of multiple other systems in nature, highly relevant to the performance of economic markets and states. Neoliberalism thus denies the fragility of things, as Connolly calls it, with its anthropocentric utopian idea of self-adjusting markets that, if only we stay out of their way, will function rightly. For Connolly, progressives should therefore resist neoliberalism by emphasizing our radical interdependency on valuable but fragile non-human processes, especially in the face of climate denialists who resist the truth that culture and politics influence the environment. Progressives must help unveil our ecological entanglements and the fragilities of late modern capitalism through critique and what he calls experimental politics. He believes that we cannot wait for a revolution, but must engage in diverse strategies of resistance and even reform. We're running out of time, he believes. For in a world of fragile becomings, the future is not fully determined. So the consequences of our strategies and experimental politics are never entirely predictable. This open-endedness can thus be a source of hope, Connolly believes. Finally, he calls for the construction of eco-political movements that include religious and secular persons. As a non-theist, he writes, it is imperative to negotiate new connections between non-theistic constituencies who care about the future of the earth and numerous devotees of diverse religious traditions who fold positive spiritualities into their creedal practices. The new multifaceted movement needed today, if it emerges, will take the shape of what he calls a vibrant pluralist assemblage. We need not therefore dissolve our differences to form such an eco-activist assemblage. But might we learn to foreground certain resonances between multiple constituencies for the sake of the planet, such as shared commitments to extending value and reality to non-human processes, as Whitehead has taught us? I certainly hope so. The future of the earth may depend on it.
Oh, stay. We're gonna play a game real quick.
Okay.
Just because it seems like a good idea.
Cards Against Humanity?
Cards Against Humanity. No, we're working against humanity already. We're gonna try to undo it. Okay, so we're gonna play a game called How Kantian Dualism Ruined All the Important Christian Doctrines. All right, but I will write them up there, and then You'll pick a side, I'll play the other side, and in 2 minutes we'll show how if you get rid of the Kantian bifurcation of philosophy, that if you just kind of embrace a kind of Whiteheadian notion, the doctrines don't suck as bad, and maybe less people will die. All right, so human person, so write it down that way we get them all. So one's human person, then you brought up the nature-culture dualism. You implied kind of the individualism of the West, which we can work out by talking about how we usually see atonement or justification or whatever. Yeah. Eschatology. And then divine action. All right, so those five kind of normal areas of Christian theology came up in it and are implied in kind of the philosophical critique. And one of the things that will be running through people's head if they don't just hang out, right, reading the same books you're reading is like, I don't even know what a bifurcation of a what is a Kant. And so I'm interested if you could tell me how this Kantian dualism is set up changes the way we as Christians, maybe not knowing it, are implicitly Kantian as we understand the human person.
As far as the bifurcation of nature goes?
Yeah.
Well, human persons become sort of disconnected from their ecological context. And this leads, they're all interconnected, because once you sort of put human persons on the side of culture and everything else on the side of non-human nature, you end up with this split where the human side of things become privileged at the expense of nature. And so this feeds right into individualism, when we're out of relation, in a sense, to mechanistic nature.
Yeah, and all the way down to, right, like, even if you think about the human person, one of the images Catherine Keller uses to talk about kind of Whiteheadian postmodernism Whitehead has this notion of misplaced concreteness, which is essentially like really sweet things we think are final that aren't. But like if everyone in the room assumes X is the case, then it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It functions that way. And false ideas that everyone believes actually impact our embodied being. So if you all believe a lie, then we will perform it together as a culture, as a people, as a community, so that it affects you and actually changes your own existence, right? So if you're in a community and your expectation is that your kind of own understanding of your sexual identity is not available for a blessed option, then even if that's not true, it affects you and gets on you, right? In the same way, if what God really wants to redeem and save is your soul, and your embodied existence kind of tertiary, right? That same content dualism goes down. So I'm interested in, as someone who's like grown up in the church and slowly kind of connected these dots, but not left it behind. Why aren't you joining them? Like, what hope do you see in these doctrines that we've managed to keep thoroughly dualistic?
Why am I not joining the new realists? That's a really complicated question. I mean, at a basic level, Christianity continues to be compelling at a deep level for me, and it continues to inspire a lot of the ecological thinking and work that I've found myself doing. And for me, ecological theology became sort of a gateway back into rereading Scripture from that new lens that sort of brought new angles out that I'd never seen before. So I found a lot of power in that tradition that I didn't realize was there. And that's sort of reawakened my hope that Christianity and other traditions can work together to solve these crises.
I remember when you were working on your master's thesis here, and we would have our little nighttime powwows until early in the evening, or early in the morning. Early in the evening we hadn't even started. And we were talking about, you were working on the Cobb and Moltmann comparison, and one of the conversations we had, and I remember it enough, I wrote it on one of my little note cards, so I have no idea who said it, but if it's good, you can keep it, if not, it's my fault, we were talking about the way individualism takes shape in our notions of sin. That the most common dominant images of sin, like we see the word, and then we think something between me and God. And then we talked about how, like, even if you just reread Genesis 1 through 11, the notion of sin there is like a snowballing one. So it's a breakdown between human beings, between each other, between God, between nature, between like human beings and the world, like the blood on the ground when Cain kills Abel cries out. I'm interested if you think Whitehead it helps us come to understand, in a sense, these narratives, or what are some ways that he helps us understand narratives that are much richer and deeper in the tradition of Scripture.
Narratives?
Yeah, because you.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the work that I did was on rethinking Christology in the light of Whitehead's work, and developing a cosmic Christology where Christ's saving work actually was in relation to nature. And this was done a lot in some of the submerged traditions. There was a lot more of this in the mystical traditions that I had to kind of unearth, and I found it a lot in Moltmann's work as well. But finding a way to relate Christ's saving activity to nature itself became a new way to think about the Christian narrative in the New Testament in particular. That's what I did most of my work on.
Mm-hmm. So if I just heard that, I'm like, well, you did it, I'm interested. Mm-hmm. Tell me something about Jesus. I didn't hear it at all through there. You said theology, you didn't talk about Jesus, Austin.
Mm-hmm. Right.
No, it's true. Trying to do something a little broader. So the way that I approached it was directly through Cobb's notion of the Logos Christology, where, I don't know how much you want to get into Whiteheadian metaphysics in this, but for Cobb, the primordial nature of God is the source of the divine lore. And for Christ, Christ becomes his sort of symbol for what happens when the divine lore becomes incarnate. And that becomes incarnate everywhere, but it became incarnate in a very particular way in Jesus Christ. And so for him, wherever the divine lore becomes incarnate, he locates Christ there. So Christ becomes a part of the saving work of a broken, fragile nature. That sort of vision really changed the way that sort of moved away from a lot of the individualism and expanded the dualism between nature and culture, where Christ actually gets out of the individualistic culture side of things into nature.
Okay, so say a little bit about how that notion of a sense of logos, call and response style Christology, like what's the understanding of divine action behind it? Because if Kant helped us just never ask the question, right, about divine action. Then we have people who go, all right, well, don't talk about it because it's supernaturalist. So, like, whatever God does, God decides to do whatever the hell God wants to do when God wants to do it, and nature can just get out of the way. So, how do you kind of imagine God's relationship with the world without going all supernatural?
Right. So a lot of that has to do with the way we think of divine action being persuasive versus coercive, as I mentioned. And Griffin's done a lot of work with trying to rethink the way that God can actually act in a meaningful way, in a realistic way, not just symbolically, but actually have some sort of effect in the world beyond the human, but also within the human. So the divine lure is that sense of God offering those possibilities that every creature, or what Whitehead called actual occasions, can resist or actualize into creation. And so, God continues to need the cooperation from the human level all the way down and all the way up. So there's no point in nature where divine action becomes unilateral. It's always cooperative.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome.